Okay, sorry for that slight delay, everyone. But hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for tonight's lecture. I'm Aaron Turner, coordinator for the Center for Photographers of Color, which along with the School of Art tonight is hosting the event. I just want to take a quick second to briefly introduce the Center for Photographers of Color, and then we'll move forward from there. The mission for the Center for Photographers of Color seeks to promote emerging and underrepresented artists of color working within photography, digital imaging, and other lens-based media. Our goal is to collaborate with artists from diverse backgrounds whose work challenges the monolithic historical narratives within culture and art. Through this collaborative approach, the center aims to create a sustainable creative community through the commissioning, support, or history and archiving of original works as a public education resource to address identity and representation. The center's programming for the university and community aims to explore ways of creating positive change and show examples of how to influence and inform thinking and practice in various cultural and social settings. We are dedicated to diversity in art, strengthening the community, the region, and the state with outreach efforts that are relevant, meaningful, and have significant impact. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it on to our artist liaison, Junli Song, first-year MFA student in printmaking, to introduce our speaker tonight, Rachelle Mozman Solano.
All right, it's my pleasure to introduce Rachelle to you guys. So Rachelle Mozman Solano grew up in New York City of parents who shared the experience of immigration. She works between New York and Panama, which is the country of her maternal family. She often starts from her biography and family history in order to explore how culture shapes individuals and how environment conditions behavior. Her work is concerned with the intersection of mythology, history, economics, and the psyche through photographs and films that confound fact and fictional narrative. In her work, narrative is explored as inherent to our humanity and shaped by perception. Mozman Solano's work is deeply informed by her clinical work in psychoanalysis. In 2018, she exhibited El espejo opaco de Gauguin in Arteconsult in Panama City. And in 2017, she exhibited in A New Region of the World at Bunkier Sztuki in Krako, Poland, and also at LARA, Latin American Roaming Art in Panama. In 2016, Mozman Solano exhibited in the 10th Bienal Centroame, and in 2015, she exhibited in Dutel at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania, and also in Portraiture Now, Staging the Self at America's Society. She has been awarded residencies at LMCC Workshop, SMAC Mellon, the Camera Club of New York, and Lightwork. Her work has been published in the Lightwork Annual, Contact Sheet, Presumed Innocence, Exit Magazine, and numerous other publications. Mozman Solano is also a Fulbright Fellow and has exhibited at the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian Institution in DC, the Americas Society in New York, the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Studio Museum in Harlem in NYC, the Chelsea Museum in New York, the De Cordova Sculpture Park and Museum in Lincoln, Massachusetts, the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, California, the Shore Institute of Contemporary Art in Long Branch, New Jersey, Festival de la Luz at the Centro Cultural Recoleta in Buenos Aires, Argentina, the Instituto Cultural Itaú in Sao Paulo, Brazil, the Friese Museum in Berlin, Germany, the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Santiago, Chile, the Museo Nacional de Artes Visuales in Montevideo, Uruguay, the Centro Cultural de España in Mexico City, the Festival Biarritz in Biarritz, France, as well as the 9th Bienal de Cuenca in Ecuador. She's obviously very talented and well-respected. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rachelle.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining. It's interesting to hear your resume being read out loud like that. I'm going to share my screen and go into the work I'm going to show you. So I'm going to start, let me turn this light off, it's a little blinding. I'm going to start with some work that I made in Panama City around 2006. And I'm going to start there because I decided to show my work chronologically, kind of going back some years. And I moved to Panama in about 2006. I had lived there on several other occasions in my adult life. When in 2006, I was in my early 30s, and I was teaching everywhere in New York, like adjuncting at 4 different schools, and just very exhausted, and really admired an artist friend I had who lives in Panama named Gustavo Araujo, who made great work, showed in lots of biennials, and seemed to have a ton of free time. And he could surf, and he just seemed to have this ideal life. So I, needed a change in my life, and I decided I would make this change. And it was sort of like a brave thing to do. And part of why I did it was because I had been making work in the US, primarily in New Jersey, where I worked, and Connecticut, also kind of where I worked, close to where I worked, called American Exurbia, which was about children and women living in gated communities. And what drew me to that was the election of George Bush and an article I read in the New York Times about how Exurbia and the people that moved to Exurbia, so basically this change in demographics was what led to George Bush having won that election. It was also slightly another reason why I decided to leave the country. I was like so ashamed. Little did I know that I would grow more ashamed. So I was really interested in the fact that in Panama there was what was looking like a similar gated community. It looked the same, except that to what I'm showing you right now, which is in Connecticut. This is in Connecticut. So I'm just showing you a few examples of the work that I made for American Exurbia. So they were pictures that I made of people that I would basically find like at the Dunkin' Donuts near the college that I taught at the time. And I would approach them telling them that I was a professor at the college, and it was before cell phones, and people were more innocent generally. And I would call them on the phone on their landlines, and I would try to get them to, to let me in to make their photograph. And I got a lot of people to let me in, and I realized, I'll just go back because I think it's important, and I'm not showing too many examples of this older work. I was really interested in getting inside because I was interested in the idea of the gate and feeling that I was gated out. And I realized that in some ways, it was an opportunity for me, who had felt very othered, to kind of get inside and feel that I could learn, learn from, not just like watching people on a television show, but actually be inside these environments that felt very foreign to me. With how I grew up with like immigrant parents and, just everything. So when I went to Panama, so this is made in Panama, I started photographing in a newly gated community called Costa del Este. There were different ones, but it was in Costa del Este, which is basically functioning very much like the American Exurbia. It was like a new city that was for middle class and upper middle class people to feel safe and to segregate themselves essentially from, people who they felt were not part of their class. And so this had different sort of, this sort of like changed the city basically, because it's like a whole new city of like middle class and upper middle class people like moved out of Panama City into this new city that was only like a 15-minute drive. And as I started photographing mostly the children, because I was again interested in the children, I realized that I was really interested in the relationship of the nannies to the children. And I realized that I was just making so many pictures of this relationship, partly because the mothers were often not there, and who was there raising the children were the nannies. And what I found in making this work was that in terms of class, these children were much wealthier than the children in American exurbia. But, you know, the sort of, you know, the sort of ideology behind the segregated, gated community was the same. It was like to create, you know, a bubble that was exclusive, you know, along the lines of race and class. Often the maids were, or the nannies, like for instance, this young girl, really, she's like a teenager. She was probably maybe 15 at the most. They tended to be indigenous or Afro-Caribbean, you know, Afro-Panamanian, and very young. This was actually made in Guatemala. As a consequence of starting that project, and of living in Panama, I stayed for about 3 years. I traveled in the region because I just had opportunities to show there. And it was actually really a great existence in some ways, except that I was making no money. So I eventually had to move back. I just couldn't afford to keep living there. I was able to show and to make work. So it was really a great time for me because I was able to make a lot of work. So after, you know, maybe 2.5 years of kind of just exclusively focusing on these pictures, I grew very depressed by them. I felt so saddened by sort of the lack of connectivity that I was achieving with the children. I felt more connection to the nannies than to the children. But then the nannies also, you know, there's a way in which I was being perceived as a like hired help. And I started feeling that from the gaze that was being returned to me as I was making the portraits. I felt that I wasn't connecting with them, and it sort of left me feeling very down. And so I started sort of making other images that were of mostly girls in Panama, and sort of trying to you know, engage with how beautiful the nature is there. This one didn't do that. These were my neighbors. They lived like a block from me, and I was just in love with these 3 girls because they were always hugging just like this. They would walk around hugging and so affectionate with one another, and they were beautiful. And, you know, we would say hi, and then you know, the dad was very friendly, and he just let me, you know, photograph them on more than one occasion. And I started, you know, making, you know, pictures that were trying to engage with like the landscape. This is in Portobelo, which is a town, a very important historic town where the silver from Peru was brought in, you know, into their aduanas, which is like their customs house. And then they would cross the silver over the country to the Caribbean side of, to the Pacific side, where it would be then shipped to Spain. And the same with slaves that would come in, although there was no slavery in Panama, but they would be brought, and, you know, these people would be kept in this customs house, which is just, you know, crazy. So these are the descendants actually of marooned people that would run away. And they, you know, so I was very interested in sort of photographing the people in this community, and I would stay there because a friend of mine had a house there and, you know, was part of that community. But I had to leave and move back to New York because I was really just not able to make enough money to sustain my art practice. As we all know, you know, your art practice is like a huge investment and hugely expensive. What was interesting was that when I came back to New York, where I grew up, my mother was living here, and I really felt like I wanted to return to making pictures of her because she was my first subject. She was kind of my first muse, you know, like often in photography, we have a muse, and she was that person. But I felt very conflicted and confused by how to represent her in pictures, because I didn't, you know, early on especially, I didn't know exactly how to address what I felt to be like a very complex person. And I also really wanted to talk about her through sort of my interest in the culture that she came from, and sort of this sort of issues, societal issues that she was, you know, grew up in, and what really informed her and made her who she is. And part of that complexity was the complexity around her identity that I always sort of, you know, sort of like picked up on and sort of analyzed. And it was this sort of like internal sort of conflict around, you know, issues around race and class. You know, going back to the conversation about the Caribbean, and I could even connect it to the town Portobello, you know, the Caribbean is historically just very mixed, and most people are very mixed, and that's true of my mother's family. And she happens to be very progressive, but one grows up just kind of like in a state of denial, because that's sort of what the culture teaches you. So I was very interested in that. So another thing is that I was really interested in the, you know, like the stories that she would tell me repeatedly from her past. And they were often very much about her aunts, and they were often about, and her mother, and they were often about how like a lighter skinned aunt might have been able to move higher up in sort of the social echelon. So there's a lot of this sort of like internal, you know, like conversation and sort of ideas around class and sort of status that's attached to skin tone. So I came up with this sort of way to way to resolve this issue for myself of like, what if I just have her play like all these roles, which would really represent the women in her family, you know, like her aunts and her mother. So I began making these pictures, which meant returning to Panama, which personally I was very happy about, because I was very conflicted about having moved away anyway. And, you know, I still had a ton of family and friends there. And I would ask my mom to come with me, and we would make these photographs there. It was, this one, I made this in Guatemala, actually, in a historic museum. So I was really, the reason why I did that, of going back there, was because I really wanted the space and the architecture and the objects to be a protagonist. I almost wanted that to be the number one protagonist, which was the story about colonialism, the story about what the ideology that was, you know, inherited from the Spaniards, because they brought over their racism, and then perpetuated by the Americans. You know, the Americans basically created like a, you know, a situation where Panama was liberated from Colombia, and then they were free to build the canal. But when they did that, they created a canal zone, which was a gated community, which I just figured out just like a couple of years ago that, oh yeah, gated community. Okay, why do I keep going back to gated community? Because Panama was basically, the Americans had a gated community in Panama where they were first-class people, you know, they paid Americans in gold coins, and Panamanians were paid in silver, and Panamanians couldn't enter that canal zone. So you were really treated as a second-class citizen in your own country. And they brought over their ideology of segregation. So, you know, I went back to this fascination with the maid figure, the domestic worker. And part of that was really the fact that I had grown up here. And so growing up here meant, you know, especially in the 70s when I grew up, that there was a lot of shame attached to growing up Latina and speaking Spanish. And there was a feeling that if you were Latino, you were maybe a maid, or, you know, you were doing some kind of menial job and of a different class. So that there was this sort of like internalized feeling of sort of shame that I was sort of, you know, addressing through the work and having her play a maid. And I also think that that's partly how she felt living here. She felt like she was marginalized, you know. So because had she stayed in Panama, she would not have been a domestic worker. She, you know, she was not going to be a rich woman, but she was not going to be a domestic worker. So I definitely use this role. And I made the pictures again in these environments that I felt, you know, would talk about this history of colonialism. This was made in Nicaragua. I had a friend, a Nicaraguan artist, who invited me, you know, to come to Nicaragua, and I did. And I got to know some, you know, a filmmaker couple that were very friendly, and this was their house. Their house was 200 years old, and they let me photograph in there. This house was a house of Carlos Endara, who was a very prominent Ecuadorian photographer who had immigrated to Panama and made amazing photographs at the beginning of the 20th century in Panama. And a little like inside joke, if you know Spanish magazines, this magazine Hola is like, it's very celebratory of the Spanish oligarchy. So this is not like uncommon if you, you know, are really interested in classism and sort of perceiving yourself as being sort of above everyone, to sort of read Hola. And, you know, I felt like the pictures were really about the conflict between the characters, which is really talking about the internal conflict my mother, you know, would sort of display within herself. You know, I felt like I was really talking about her internal conflicts. And so I had a twin sister, you know, who was a darker twin sister. And this sort of talked about Caribbean families. You know, in a Caribbean family, you do have that. In my family and other families I know, and I find that very interesting because it goes against what we're sort of told, you know, that, you know, especially here, which is very binary, and humanity is not binary. So this is a photograph of the exhibit I had at the Portrait Gallery. I just wanted to show you the scale of it and sort of how it was hung. And this is how I printed the images and the scale that I was showing the images at. I showed the pictures in, you know, different publications. I just added a few. There's more, but this is a Mexican magazine from the University of Mexico, and it was published in here fairly recently. This is How We Do Both, about making art as a mother. I made this iteration of the images for the ICA, so they were displayed like this. And, you know, I spent a couple of years traveling with my mom back to Central America primarily to make those photographs. And then I had a baby, and it made just traveling just so hard. And my mother was also just not so interested in traveling anymore. And because I was back living home, I grew more interested in this period where my mother and her aunt, my aunt, her sister, and my grandmother moved to the States, which was in the mid-60s. And this happened because my grandmother remarried, and she married an American, like an engineer or some kind of, I think he was an engineer in the Canal Zone, which probably was like, you know, this was Panamanian women really wanted to marry American men, you know, because it's the perception that living in the United States would be better, all of that. So they moved to where he grew up, which was in Maryland at first, and then later on to Woodstock, Virginia, which is this tiny little rural town. That's actually where his family was from and where he grew up. And so when I would visit my grandmother, I would visit her in this little town that she lived on in Main Street, called Main Street. So if you've read Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, but this was like a southern iteration of that. Very small town. And it just kind of scared me to like get on the bus from New York and go down there, you know, like the climate back then in the mid 70s when I was visiting her in the late 70s was kind of like what it is today. So I began making photographs again from those memories and also stories my mother would tell me. You know, I interviewed my mother, but also photographs. So I started using photographs to sort of shape the pictures I was going to tell and make. And some of them were even just based, like this one is sort of based on a memory. And my memory was that my grandmother had a huge makeup box, you know, like a big vanity, and it was enormous. And she would put on this white powder and kind of become a shade lighter. And it was very remarkable to watch her do this. And I mean, I think that women would do that anyway, you know, but it was interesting to watch her do that. And I would think about it. It was something that, you know, a memory that got kind of logged into my brain. So the story is really about my grandmother, and then to make the character that plays my mother, I would make pictures of my mother, and then I would stand in her place. So I would change all my clothes and stand, you know, do what she was doing. And then I would use pieces of my face to sort of juvenate this character. And that would be the character of my mother as a younger person. And to do that, I would often have a friend or like an assistant help me to make the pictures. This one is made in New York, and I, you know, so later on, my mother and her sister moved to, well, actually very, like maybe a year into living in this country, they moved to New York because they just like couldn't deal with Maryland. And then my grandmother moved to Virginia. This is actually a picture which is very much about my mother's relationship to the family that my grandmother married into. So it's about the stepsister and the rivalry that she felt, and the weirdness that was there. And, you know, I felt like in making these photographs that I was making sort of like a film, like combination of film still meets family photo. You know, I was like living somewhere in those two worlds. And I'm very interested in sets and collaging. And so I, you know, as you can probably tell from the early pictures I showed, I use a lot of manipulation, you know, with the face especially. Some of them have more than others. And so that's the last picture. I just wanted to, you know, like, so this is the last picture I'm going to share from these two chapters, which I have published in a book. And I'll show you a picture of that, that I just published this past year, 2020, the worst year possibly of our lives, with Chris Graves. And so then, you know, sort of right when I was ending, felt that I had to end that work, not because I wanted to, but really because my mother just like was like, I can't do this anymore. You have to find something else to photograph. She just, you know, I think if it were up to me, I would still just be photographing her. Actually, and I did return to her as a subject, and I'll show you that later. But I made a few of these photographs that were really like kind of experimental. I do like them. And they were very much about media and American media and sort of, you know, the binary, the binary nature that we're taught to believe in the country, and how that's, you know, perpetuated in media and how we're indoctrinated. So I began to make a few photographs sort of about that. And they're kind of like fantasy pictures of like, you know, these characters or these subjects performing a role of, and some of them reference actual films. Like this one references White Cargo, which has Hedy Lamarr, who I think was like, if I'm not mistaken, Austrian. So at the time I was doing like some research, you know, on like, you know, the darkening and like the makeup that was happening in Hollywood films, because they didn't want to cast actual brown and black people. Because, you know, whatever, they, not just racism, but they're all of their crazy ideas. And just playing with like this idea of makeup, which I think, you know, informed like the piece I made later on with Gauguin and some of the photographs I made. And then I made a film called Loneliness Lonely, which is sort of like bringing those interests together. So I used the Heathers, the film The Heathers, as like the template, and then I brought in other films like The Pawnbroker, which is about suffering and genocide, and I brought in a couple more films like West Side Story, which, you know, happened to be one of my favorite films growing up. As corny as that might sound, I really did love that film. So I think that this is a clip of it. Let me see. So I'm going to play that.
Mama, are you happy? Are you happy?
There are more
There are
important
more
things than
important
happiness.
things than happiness. Like what?
Survival?
Heather Chandler is from an all-American family, descendants of the Mayflower. She walks into the kitchen, her parents read in silence.
I'm leaving now.
I'm leaving now.
I said I'm going to school now.
I'm going to school now.
Have a good day, dear.
Have a good day, dear.
Dad?
Dad?
Dad, will you be home
Dad.
tonight?
Will you be home tonight?
No, Heather, I'm sorry.
No,
too much
Heather.
work.
I'm sorry. Too much work.
Maybe
Your mother will be home.
No.
Mrs. Chandler sips her coffee. Heather lives with her father in Purcellville. He became a refugee after the genocide. Now she looks at a magazine, Better Homes and
Dad.
Gardens.
I'm going to school now.
Dad, I'm going to school now.
Yes,
Right.
Nazima.
Nyanzima.
It's Heather.
Heather, remember?
Yes, yes.
Oh, yes,
I remember.
I remember.
By the way,
Is
how is school?
Going
Are
well?
you studying?
It's fine.
Yes, Daddy.
Dad, look,
Dad,
wouldn't it be awesome if
wouldn't
we
it
lived
be
in a house
awesome
like
to live
this?
in a house like this?
It will be fine.
It
but
would be
that
fine, but that's
is
not changing.
you. I know you.
Whatever.
Okay, so I'll just show you another like
It's so
small part
righteous
of
to be
this.
in a Veronica Sawyer, Heather Chandler sandwich. Panchiriniran. Who does the new kid think he
Heather's
is?
grandson, no doubt.
Let's kick his ass. Ram sticks his finger through a quesadilla on JD's plate.
Okay, so that was really about the children of immigrants and sort of their, you know, desire and effort to assimilate, and the complexity of carrying a narrative from their parents that's part of them. You know, it makes you who you are into a new culture, which is different, with very different problems and complexities. And I filmed that entire thing in this very narrow studio because I didn't have that much money and I couldn't rent a shooting studio, and mostly had actors except for a couple of friends that were in it. And I just wanted to show you this, which I was sort of making a little bit before and maybe simultaneously to that film, which were portraits. I mean, this is my husband's family, and, you know, like our children in Panama. And I wanted to make photographs also of friends. And I wanted to make pictures, portraits of family portraits that really talked about the non-binariness that I feel the Caribbean is. And it's a project that I really haven't shown. I haven't really made very many of the pictures. And I just, you know, I keep thinking, I mean, I need to work on this again, you know, probably after COVID. This is actually my mother's cousin and his wife, and their child, who's an adult, wasn't in the picture. And my son does not look like this anymore. And And I look so tired in this, and it's probably because my kid who's going bananas in the corner was just exhausting me. So then I went to a show at MoMA about Gauguin, and I was just like, this is the most frustrating show, because it just felt like the curators had not dug into what I was feeling, which was that Gauguin was like a great promoter of this identity he created and constructed for himself, partly by moving to Polynesia and becoming what he perceived as being like closer to animal. Quite literally, he says that, and he perceived the Polynesian people as being more close to being animals, and they just sort of like glazed over something that I thought was like far more complicated and kind of enraging too, but interesting, because I tend to love to characterize like white men as being sort of narcissistic. And I kind of see this pattern in my work as I keep going. I'm like, oh, I keep doing that. So Peter, who is this great funny actor, is very open to playing that role, and he did that for me. So I filmed this in a shooting studio.
He will ask to make a portrait. What is there? Just a portrait. Into your eyes. His hunger to consume your lies. In your lack of compromise. He will ask to make your portrait.
Senor Gauguin,
Yes?
I came to pick you up. Your brother-in-law sent for you.
Ah, yes. My God, it's humid. Is it always this hot here?
Yes, always. It's the humidity.
We're going to an island far away from the city.
Yes, it's away. You will do good work there. Your brother-in-law said you make portraits.
Dear, here I am in Panama. In excellent health as always. The voyage was tough. Bad weather and third-class passengers packed like sheep. In 8 days' time, we should be on our tiny island, living like savages. And I assure you, theirs is not the unhappiest lot.
Okay, I'm going to stop and show you another clip. And I should tell you that before Gauguin went to Polynesia, he had planned to live in Panama and went to Panama and stayed there and ended up very broke, worked for the canal, became very ill and had to leave and hated it. So I have the fantasy that it was partly because it was too diverse and too modern, and he had a fantasy of finding something, really primitive. I mean, he uses that language, obviously. So the script was made from his writings, primarily his writings, a little bit of mine here and there, but mostly his.
I had wished for a long time to make a portrait of one of my neighbors, a young woman of seemingly pure extraction, as there were few on the island. One day she finally became emboldened enough to enter my hut and look at my work that hung on the walls. She regarded the Olympia for a long time and with special interest. What do you think of her?
She's very beautiful.
Had she then a sense of the beautiful?
Is she a wife?
Yes. While she was curiously examining the work, I, without her noticing it, made her portrait. He saw and cried out, "No," and fled. About an hour later, she returned dressed in a beautiful robe with a flower behind her ear. Was it coquetry? Was it the pleasure of consenting of her own free will after she had refused?
Okay, I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit. So before I filmed that, I made a few photographs that helped me kind of understand how I wanted to make the video aesthetically. And yeah, so some of them are collages like this one, and others are just photographs I made in studio. This is that town, Portobello, and women who I knew in that town. And I was interested in this idea of bringing in like ethnographic photographs, partly because Gauguin actually made photographs and he would paint from them. And I showed the work there in Panama, and this is how I showed it. The film was on a monitor. And then I showed it at Mellon and I was able to project it, and I was able to do more of what I wanted to, because it was harder to convince the curators there. It was also 3 curators, all women, to let me just do what I wanted. And also the space had limitations, and I was happier with this iteration of the show. Then I was invited to do Latin American roaming art and given a budget to make something. So I was like, oh my God, I'm making this the next film I want to make. And I already kind of knew that it was going to be about united fruit and its relationship to Central America, in this film specifically to Panama. But I sort of created this story where, you know, the original owner named Minor Keith, or creator, founder of United Fruit, was a dying Cavendish banana. The Cavendish is a species that was created, you know, all these bananas we eat are man-made, and they are they don't have a sex. You can't like plant just banana seed and grow a Cavendish. So they require crossing over. And so I was interested in this idea of these like dead bananas as lovers and their lack of sex. So I'll play for you a little piece of this.
We had no idea what we were seeing. We couldn't see the details, make out the vast nuances, or value the differences of the endless jungle. The Panama disease used to kill everything. The only solution was to get a hold of new lands. So when one farm died off, another was planted. One would die, another was planted. One would die, another was planted. When you see the narrowing genetic culture, that's when you know things are going to die. UFC, Puritan superior are we? Broke no sweat, manufacturing desire, creating our banana empire. Off the bodies we miserably hire. UFC. Minor Keith didn't care about your life. It's all for the banana cream pie. We did good by our shareholders. UFC.
I'm just gonna speed it along.
I was mine.
Because it's a little bit long and I don't.
Hola.
Banana? ¿Por qué te ves así?
enfermo. It's Panama disease. I would invite you to sit with me, but I may not get up.
¿Cómo te pasó?
Genes. We Cavendish are homogeneous. Who knew homogeneity would be our death?
Okay, so I was just so interested in the fact that that is partly why the other banana, the Gros Michel that people used to eat in the 50s, died, because they can't fight off diseases because they're not diverse. And, you know, so in 2018, I began to make these recordings of my mother, and it was sort of like this anxiety that I felt like after Trump won, but really that the child family separation was happening that summer, and it was just like I was just filled with anxiety of the unknown and just what was happening. So I began to photograph and videotape. I record my mother in her apartment, and miraculously she was letting me, because she's slightly a hoarder, like I would say like an outsider artist hoarder, you know, like interesting, strange sculptures of like egg cartons that like, I don't know how she delicately balances, that type of thing. And she just, you know, I just found like the stories interesting and chose to then make a script out of them and have them perform. So I'll play a clip for you.
Monday at around 4:45 or something like that, I was walking, you know, usually I walk on the other side of the street, but this time I was walking on the right side leading toward building. And this woman had come out already with her dog. And I passed by her and she stomped her feet when I was passing by. Ignore it completely. Then she took off in her bicycle with her dog. She has a bicycle there with a chain to some post, and took off with the dog. In other words, the dog runs with her riding the bicycle, which, I mean, I've seen that already, but in New York City with all the cars, you know, I called the detective at the precinct, and of course he says, do you know her name? Maybe she lives with family. I don't know anything. I don't know her name. I mean,
has that ever happened to you before?
She's constantly accosting me. I mean, this is not the first time. The other thing that she does that is dangerous is that when she sees me coming, she will extend her leash, let her leash loose, so this dog can...
To intimidate you?
Not to intimidate me, but to tell me that she can command this dog to attack me, because that's how I interpret it.
Okay, so I'll show you one more. Actually,
Monday,
sorry. One more clip.
It's a very old tree, and not only that, it's an old tree. It's an oak. Wait a minute. Is it an oak? Yeah. Y esa vaina se cae, Rachelle, se llamaba perico, porque eso, it will fall on us in our house. It will destroy two houses, their house and our house. Yeah, I don't think my unhappiness was the house, but something else, like other things. I don't think it would have been any different if I had been in Panama. Because, you know, there I had very, I mean, what work could have done? It would have been a disaster.
Really?
I'll stay in Panama, probably.
Why do you feel that way?
Shell, because conditions there for people are, I would have had to earn a living. And the living would have been minimal.
Okay, so I'm almost done with my presentation. I just wanted to show you a couple of things that I'm working on in the last year. Mostly a lot of research about US, Central American and border politics and history. And I've been making these in-studio photographs where I'm really deriving the inspiration for each picture from like one of these things I've read or a piece of narrative or story. Collaging them. So, you know, using Photoshop differently, you know, still using it, but differently. And I thought it would be fun to just show you, well, this is a cover of the book that I just published about the Casa de Mujeres and La Negra series, which included some interviews, one with my mother and her mother, and one with my mother and myself. And I thought it would be funny to show you just some of the books I'm reading toward these photographs, which I'm also planning to, I'm working toward a script for another film. So these books plus more is like part of the research, and so I thought I would share it. So that actually concludes my presentation, and I feel like I made it within the time frame. I'm going to stop sharing pretty much on time.
Wow. Thank you so much, Rachelle. That was amazing. The entire time you were presenting it, it was making me think back to our podcast conversation, I don't know, about a year ago now. So yeah, and to everyone, feel free. I'm not sure if June Lee, if you can see Q&A questions that are in there that I can't, but I would encourage people to go ahead and put questions in the chat or the Q&A, whichever one is better for you. But to kind of keep things going, which I have a prepared question for you to give us some time. But I was just so interested in, you know, I've told you this before, your films are hilarious. And I really enjoy viewing them. But how did you get to this heightened awareness of the use of the protagonist? Because in all your bodies of work, you're able to place other individuals in the role of the protagonist. And then in that work in the mid 2000s, you enter the work as the protagonist, playing the role of your mother and the things going on with that. And then on to your films that relate back to history. So how did you get to that point of acknowledgement in the role of the protagonist to be this driving underlying force within your work, your photographs and your films?
Where I'm kind of focusing on a person, on an individual life and experience. I think more and more, I mean, I also trained as a psychoanalyst for many years and gave therapy. And I think that more and more that interest in a person's individual experience and their voice, just like it grew. And I loved, one of the things I loved and miss about giving therapy is just hearing a person's stories. You know, it's like, there's something about that, even just the experience of like the oral experience and the listening experience that I really enjoy. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I feel like that's a part of it.
Yes, it does answer that for me. Trent, do you want to take the question and the Q&A from Elise?
Sure, let me see if I can find it. Okay, so there's one question from Elise. Thank you so much for sharing your work. Do you find that your work is driven by introspection about yourself or more so curiosity about others' stories?
I think at this point more curiosity about other stories, and I'm really interested in history, and history is something that drives my work. I feel like if anything, I'm telling stories about history to talk about the present, because I feel like we're not out, or maybe we never left, or maybe we're all just living in some like weird dimension where it's just like all happening at the same time. I'm not sure. Yeah. But I think I use my family's stories as a platform, like, because I felt that it was a great way to talk about history, was to use my family's story.
I think something that really struck me when I was listening to your interview with Aaron from last year was your work, your clinical research in psychoanalysis. That kind of, that shocked me. I'm not used to photographers having this whole other side of their lives, but I know you were a therapist for 7 years, and I was just curious which body of work was influenced most by that training. And when you're out in the field, starting something new, especially that has to do with history, how do you, what's like the hierarchy of what matters, like a narrative or how environment influences behavior, or is it seeing how like all of that meshes with history?
I'm interested in all of that, and probably the work that is most influenced by my training as an analyst is the last piece I made about my mom, the video, because it's like I kind of feel like I was recreating that experience of listening to someone tell their story, where you just give them a lot of space to just tell it. And you might ask a little bit to sort of like help them along to explain a little bit more. But I feel like it was that I really wanted that experience of just like that oral storytelling, of like, this is what happened, and then this is what happened, and and then to gradually, I know that it's a slower piece and it might not have the humor that some of the other pieces earlier, that I showed have, but like when you watch the whole thing in its entirety, you kind of you get a portrait of a person, and that was interesting for me to try to do. Yeah.
I'll give you one more question, Rachelle, kind of off the top of my head, if no one else has one in the chat Q&A, but kind of continuing on what you just answered from Trent's question, the use of filmmaking in your practice, your sets feel like a whole other body of work within the films is what I'm noticing, but I won't ask you about that now. I'll save that conversation for later. But my question for you is, can you talk about the use of humor in your work to talk about these things in terms of colonialism, racism, psychoanalysis, and the different stories that your mother passed down to you, or the observations that you depicted?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for me, humor is like a coping mechanism, and it's difficult to not, it's like, do you laugh or cry? It's like, and it's difficult. I mean, I think that there's some things that it's very difficult to, to joke about, but if you can figure out how, it's such a relief, it's such a relief because it's empowering. And I feel like that the ability to feel empowered through humor about things that are really very tragic, and also that might enrage one, is like liberating, so I feel like that's why, I found kind of like a trope of like, the narcissistic white man through this actor who could play that for me through Peter, and it helped me to, yeah, to sort of like shape around that, you know, all of the other narratives, you know. So yeah, I feel that it's just empowering, you know. But then, you know, when I made the piece about with my mother, the video of her that I finished more recently, it was harder to, I feel that it has humor, but it's a very sort of like, you're not sure really what is happening. You don't know, you know, is this woman, is this for real? You know, like you don't, there's a feeling of suspended belief, like you're not really sure what to believe. And I feel like that's sort of more what I was interested in that moment with that piece anyway, because of how things really changed, you know, in the last few years in terms of intensity, you know.
Yeah, and how intense things are now is one of the reasons I appreciate the humor in your work, because it takes a real skill with writing all the scripts and all that kind of stuff. It's a real skill to have, and like you were saying, and that's a good way to describe it, as empowering, to be able to take something like that. And the humor is in your films, but you don't miss the point, at least for me. Like the point that you're trying to make is driven even through the humor. So I just want to say I appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, I feel that yeah, it's it's something that I'll probably be going back to it with this next thing I'm making, hopefully, if I can get the money. I'll let you know, I'll keep you posted. Yeah.
Well, June Lee, if you don't have any questions, okay. Well, Rachelle, thank you so much. Just thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing your work with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
And thank you everyone for attending tonight. Everyone have a good evening. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so
Appreciate
much.
it.
Okay, bye, good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.